There is a photograph from 1889 that has sat in boxes, passed between generations, forgotten in attics and estate sales for over a century. It shows a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, standing beside a seated man in formal Victorian attire. Her small hand rests in his larger palm. The light is soft. The composition is deliberate. At first glance, it radiates tenderness. A father and daughter, frozen together in what appears to be an intimate moment of love. For decades, anyone who looked at this image saw exactly what they expected to see. A family portrait. A quiet moment of affection between parent and child. The kind of photograph that might hang in a hallway or rest on a mantelpiece, reminding future generations of those who came before. But in 2019, a photo restoration expert named Marcus Whitfield began working on this image, and what he discovered made him stop entirely. He noticed that the father's eyes were not looking at the camera. They were not looking anywhere at all. He noticed that the little girl's hand was not resting in her father's palm. It was wrapped around it, positioned carefully as if keeping it from falling. And he noticed something else. Something that changed everything. The man in this photograph was not alive when it was taken. His name was Edward Crane. The little girl was his daughter, Eleanor. And behind the camera stood a woman whose behavior in the weeks following this photograph would alarm everyone who knew her. Her name was Margaret Crane, and she was Edward's wife. After this image was captured, Margaret began an obsessive ritual that her family could not understand. She dressed her infant son, barely 6 months old, in elaborate outfits, sometimes 4 or 5 different costumes in a single day, and photographed him again and again. Servants reported hearing her speaking to the baby as if she were narrating a conversation with someone who was not in the room. She stayed awake through the night, arranging props, adjusting lighting, changing the baby's clothes and photographing him once more. Her husband's brothers believed Margaret was experiencing a complete mental collapse. They contacted a physician. They discussed the possibility of having her committed to an institution. They wrote letters to relatives expressing their fear that she had become, in their words, dangerous in her delusions. But a doctor's report, buried in county medical archives for over 130 years, tells a different story. It does not describe a woman losing her mind. It describes a woman who understood exactly what was happening, and was desperately trying to capture something before it was too late. What did Margaret Crane know that her family did not? And why does this single photograph from 1889 hold the answer? To understand what happened to the Crane family, we must first understand where and when they lived. Ashford, Connecticut in the late 1880s, was a small township in the northeastern corner of the state. It was a place of quiet farms, modest mills, and families whose names appeared in town records generation after generation. The Cranes were among them, respectable, middle class, with roots in the textile industry that sustained the region. Edward Crane was 42 years old. He managed a small mill that had belonged to his father before him. His wife, Margaret, was 29. She came from a family of educators and was known in the community as an intelligent and composed woman. They had 2 children. Eleanor, their daughter, was 7. Their son Thomas had been born in early 1889, just months before everything changed. To understand what Margaret did, and why she did it, we must also understand what photography meant during this era. In 1889, cameras were expensive. Professional portrait sessions were rare, sometimes occurring only once or twice in a person's entire lifetime. A single photograph might be the only visual record a family would ever possess of a loved one. These images were not casual snapshots. They were precious artifacts, treated with reverence, displayed with pride, and mourned when lost. There was another practice common during this period, one that modern audiences often find unsettling. It was called postmortem photography. When a family member died, particularly a child, it was customary to photograph the body, often posed to appear as if the person were merely sleeping or in some cases still alive. Eyes might be painted onto closed lids. Bodies might be propped in chairs or arranged in beds. These photographs were not considered morbid. They were considered loving tributes, final portraits to remember the dead. The Crane photograph at first glance does not obviously fit this category. Edward appears to be alive. He is seated. He is dressed. His eyes seem to be open. But as Marcus Whitfield would discover more than a century later, appearances in Victorian photography were often carefully constructed illusions. The photograph surfaced in 2017. A woman named Laura Sinclair Byrne was clearing her grandmother's estate in Hartford, Connecticut, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. Among the boxes of family ephemera, letters, receipts, faded newspaper clippings, she discovered a leather-bound case. Inside was the photograph of Edward and Eleanor. Alongside it was a bundle of letters tied with ribbon and a small leather journal with a brass clasp. Laura initially planned to donate everything to a local historical society. She had no particular attachment to these objects. They belonged to ancestors she had never known, people whose names she barely recognized. But something about the photograph caught her attention. Something she could not quite articulate. She decided to have it restored before donating it. She contacted Marcus Whitfield, a professional photo restoration specialist who had spent 2 decades working with Victorian-era images. She wanted the photograph cleaned, enhanced, and preserved. She expected a routine project. She expected to receive a cleaner version of the same image. Instead, she received an email that contained a single sentence. "I do not believe the man in this photograph was alive when it was taken." When Marcus Whitfield began his high-resolution scanning of the Crane photograph, he noticed subtle anomalies that would not be visible to the casual observer. Edward's posture was rigid in a way that suggested external support, possibly a standing frame hidden behind the chair, a common device used in post-mortem photography to keep bodies upright. His clothing was arranged with unusual precision, as if placed on him rather than worn naturally. And his complexion showed signs of careful retouching, even in the original print. Someone had added color to his cheeks using tinting techniques that Whitfield recognized immediately. They were techniques used specifically to simulate life in the deceased. But it was Edward's eyes that disturbed Whitfield most. In the original print, they appeared to be gazing slightly downward as if lost in thought. Upon digital enhancement, Whitfield realized they were not gazing at all. The eyes had been painted open onto closed lids. The brushwork was skilled, clearly done by someone with experience, but under magnification, it was unmistakable. These were not the eyes of a living man. Whitfield consulted with Dr. Helena Rourke, a cultural historian who had spent decades studying Victorian death rituals and mourning practices. After examining the photograph, Dr. Rourke confirmed what Whitfield suspected. The positioning of the little girl, Eleanor, was consistent with post-mortem family portraits. She was not leaning into her father. She was standing at a slight distance, her body language suggesting tension rather than comfort. Her hand was wrapped around his in a way that appeared supportive, as if she were holding his hand in place rather than receiving affection from it. But this discovery created a problem. Edward Crane's death certificate, on file with the state of Connecticut, lists his date of death as November 17, 1889. Records from a local photography studio, Patterson and Marsh of Willimantic, indicate that a Crane family sitting occurred on November 8 of that year. If Edward was photographed 9 days before his recorded death, then he must have been alive when the image was taken. But if the photograph shows a dead man, then either the photograph was taken later than the studio records indicate, or the date of death was wrong. Further investigation revealed a possible explanation. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Franklin Marsh, the local physician in Ashford. But cross-referencing with town records showed that Dr. Marsh was not in Ashford during the week of November 8 through November 15. He was attending a medical conference in Boston. He would not have been able to certify Edward's death until his return. This suggests that Edward may have died earlier than officially recorded, with the certificate backdated to the day the doctor actually examined the body. The studio records provided another clue. The ledger entry for November 8, 1889, lists the session as a sitting for Mrs. E. Crane and children, special arrangement. Among Victorian photographers, the phrase special arrangement was sometimes used as a coded term for postmortem sessions. It allowed families to book these appointments without explicitly naming their purpose, protecting their privacy during an unbearably painful time. Among Margaret's belongings, Laura Sinclair Byrne found more than just the single photograph of Edward and Eleanor. She found 17 additional prints, all small, all depicting the same subject. Infant Thomas dressed in different outfits. Sailor suits, christening gowns, knitted caps, formal jackets far too large for his tiny frame. The photographs appeared to have been taken over a very short period, possibly just a few days. On the back of one image, in handwriting that Laura would later confirm as Margaret's, were 3 words, "For when he forgets." This was the behavior that had so alarmed Margaret's brothers-in-law. This was the obsession they could not understand. A woman photographing her baby over and over, changing his clothes constantly, speaking to him as if explaining something to someone who was not there. They believed she had lost her mind. But a document discovered in the county medical archives tells a different story. In late November 1889, at the request of Edward's brothers, a physician named Dr. Samuel Brennan examined Margaret. His report was filed with the county health office and remained there, unread, for over 130 years. Dr. Brennan's conclusion was not that Margaret was insane. He wrote, "Mrs. Crane is suffering from anticipatory grief. She is aware that her infant son shows signs of consumptive illness and is unlikely to survive the winter. Her photographic activities are not evidence of delirium but of a mother preparing to remember. The baby was dying." Thomas had contracted tuberculosis, almost certainly from his father, who had been suffering from the disease in secret, possibly for months. Margaret knew. She could see the symptoms in her infant son. She understood what was coming. And she was racing against time to capture every possible image of him while he was still alive. Edward's death, previously attributed to a sudden ailment, was almost certainly the result of pulmonary tuberculosis. The disease was highly contagious. Margaret would have known, perhaps from symptoms she could already observe in Thomas, that the baby had been infected. She was not descending into madness. She was living with full knowledge of an approaching tragedy, watching her family die around her, and trying desperately to preserve their faces while she still could. The photograph of Eleanor holding Edward's hand was not just a post-mortem portrait. It was the first in what Margaret feared would become a series. But there is another piece to this story that changes everything. While examining town birth records, a genealogist named David Gould found an entry that the family had never discussed. In 1886, 3 years before the photograph was taken, Margaret Crane gave birth to a daughter named Clara. Clara died at 14 months of age in 1887 from what the records describe as fever and wasting illness. Almost certainly tuberculosis. Margaret had already lost one child to this disease. She had watched Clara die. She had held her daughter as the illness consumed her. And she had no photograph of Clara. None existed. When Clara died, Margaret was left with nothing but fading memories, memories that grew less clear with each passing year, until the face of her first daughter became a blur she could no longer fully recall. When Edward fell ill, Margaret made a decision. She would not let him vanish the way Clara had vanished. She would capture his image while she still could, even if it meant photographing his body after death. And she would not let Thomas vanish either. She would photograph him every day in every outfit she could find, creating a visual record so complete that forgetting would become impossible. Among Margaret's journal entries from mid-November 1889, one stands out. She wrote, "I have taken 14 likenesses of Thomas. I will take more. I will not lose him the way I lost Clara, to fog and forgetting." Another entry dated November 22 reads, "They say I am unwell. They do not understand. I am the only one who sees." Her brothers-in-law did not see. Jonathan Crane, Edward's younger brother, wrote to a lawyer inquiring about having Margaret declared mentally unfit. He described her behavior as theatrical grieving and expressed concern that she was corrupting the children's understanding of proper mourning. There is no evidence that legal action was ever taken against Margaret, possibly because Dr. Brennan's report provided a medical justification for her behavior. She was not insane. She was grieving, and she was preparing for more grief to come. But the question of Thomas remained. What happened to the baby? The historical record becomes murky at this point. There is no death certificate for Thomas Crane in Connecticut records. There is no burial record in the Crane family plot at Westford Hill Cemetery. Did the baby die, his death unrecorded in the chaos of that terrible winter? Or did something else happen? A letter from Margaret to her sister, dated February 1890, provides a clue. In it, Margaret writes, "Thomas is stronger than we dared believe. The doctor says there is reason for cautious hope. The baby may have survived." To answer this question, David Gould traced the Crane family line through census records, marriage certificates, and city directories. Eleanor Crane married in 1904 and had 3 children. She lived a long life, dying in New Haven in 1951 at the age of 69. But Thomas's trail was fainter. If he survived infancy, he left Ashford, perhaps sent away for his health, perhaps simply choosing to begin again somewhere new. Then Gould found him. A Thomas Crane appears in Massachusetts records beginning in 1910. He is listed as a textile worker in Lowell, age 21, born in Connecticut. His birthplace matches Ashford. His mother's maiden name, listed on a marriage certificate from 1914, matches Margaret's. This is almost certainly the same Thomas. The baby who was photographed 17 times in different outfits by a mother who was certain he would die. Thomas Crane married in 1914. He had 4 children. He worked in the mills of Massachusetts until the 1930s, when the textile industry began its long decline. He died in 1962 in Worcester at the age of 73. He outlived his mother by more than 50 years. He never developed active tuberculosis. The exposure in infancy either resolved on its own or remained dormant throughout his life. Margaret's darkest fear never came true. The photographs made their way through the generations. Thomas's older sister Eleanor kept their mother's belongings after Margaret died in 1911. When Eleanor died in 1951, her daughter inherited the collection. It sat in boxes, untouched, for nearly 70 years, until Laura Sinclair Byrne began clearing her grandmother's house and found the leather case containing the photograph of Edward and Eleanor. Margaret Crane never remarried after Edward's death. She raised Eleanor and Thomas alone, working as a schoolteacher in Ashford until 1905. Letters from her later years show a woman who eventually found peace, not through forgetting but through remembering. She wrote to her sister in 1909, "I look at Edward's photograph every morning. Eleanor says it frightens her. I tell her it is the opposite of frightening. It is the only proof I have that he was real." Eleanor eventually came to understand what her mother had done. In 1948, 3 years before her own death, Eleanor wrote a letter to her daughter describing the photograph. She wrote, "I remember standing beside him. I remember how cold his hand was. Mother told me to hold it gently as if he were sleeping. I did not understand then what she was doing. I understand now. She was giving me a way to keep him." After Laura Sinclair Byrne shared the photograph and its story publicly, the response was immediate and emotional. She partnered with a regional historical society to create an exhibit featuring the image of Edward and Eleanor alongside Margaret's journal and the 17 baby photographs. Local news outlets covered the exhibit. National history publications picked up the story. Researchers and academics began examining the Crane case as a window into Victorian mourning practices and the psychological experience of anticipatory grief. Dr. Helena Rourke published a paper on the photograph in a cultural history journal, calling it a perfect case study of how Victorian families navigated death in an era before modern medicine could offer hope. Other scholars began re-examining similar photographs from the period, applying new digital analysis techniques to images that had sat unexamined for over a century. But what resonated most with audiences was not the historical significance. It was the emotional truth at the center of the story. A mother trying to hold on to her family. The terror of watching a child fall ill. The tension between private grief and society's expectations. These themes are not confined to the 19th century. They are universal. They are timeless. And they struck a nerve with viewers who recognized Margaret's desperation in their own experiences of loss. Marcus Whitfield has since spoken at conferences about the ethical dimensions of his work. He argues that photo restoration is not merely technical. It is a form of excavation. It uncovers stories that previous generations may have deliberately hidden. Stories of pain, of love, of choices made in impossible circumstances. He asks audiences to consider what responsibilities come with revealing these truths. Laura Sinclair Byrne has expressed complicated feelings about her discovery. She is proud of her ancestors' strength, but she also feels the weight of Margaret's suffering across the years. She has worked to ensure that Margaret is remembered not merely as a grieving widow, but as a woman of intelligence and agency, someone who refused to accept that death meant disappearance. Some mysteries remain. The 17 baby photographs have never been fully analyzed. Some historians believe additional images may exist, perhaps in other branches of the family or in private collections that have not yet been examined. Questions linger about Edward's illness, how long he knew he was dying, whether Margaret knew before his death, and what conversations they may have had in his final weeks. The photograph itself has been professionally preserved and is now held by a Connecticut historical archive. It is occasionally displayed to the public, accompanied by materials explaining its significance and its context. Edward Crane's face, frozen in 1889, painted eyes staring at nothing, continues to look out at visitors more than a century after his death. When we look at old photographs, we make assumptions. We see a man and a child holding hands, and we assume we are witnessing a moment of love, of connection, of life. We project our own experiences onto these frozen images. We tell ourselves stories about what we are seeing. But photographs are not transparent windows into the past. They are constructed objects. They are choices made by the people who created them, choices about what to show, what to hide, what to preserve. Margaret Crane understood this better than most. She knew that death would take her husband and might take her son. She could not stop that. Medicine in 1889 could not stop that. But she could choose what would survive. She could choose their faces, their forms, their images captured in light and silver and paper. Every antique shop contains photographs whose stories have been lost. Every estate sale offers boxes of images depicting people whose names no one living remembers. Every attic holds albums full of faces that stare out at us, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be understood. The Crane photograph is not unique. It is simply one whose story was finally uncovered. There are thousands more waiting. When you look at an old photograph of someone holding another person's hand, you assume you are seeing love. Sometimes you are. But sometimes, you are seeing a woman who has already begun to let go, even as she refuses to forget.